The Memory Box was a 12-month digital inclusion project delivered across the Newcastle area and is one of 97 national programmes that were selected by the Skills Funding Agency to receive a new Community Innovation Fund. In partnership with Newcastle Libraries and Adult Learning Services, the Memory Box was designed to connect older learners to each other and their wider communities by providing them with an opportunity to engage with the latest digital technology within a supportive environment. Older residents, aged 65 and over, came together in community settings across Newcastle to work with adult learning tutors and digital storyteller Alex Henry, who aided them to script their own story based on their personal recollections of the city. The participants themselves were given the necessary skills to enable them to record and create their own audiovisual story on iPads, integrating newly digitised family photographs as well as personally researched City Library archive images. The finished digital stories were uploaded to a bespoke and freely available iPhone and iPad application, designed to remain as a social history archive with the potential to attract a worldwide audience.
In the early 1950s, I was a young teenager living with my grandmother in Low Fell, but going to school in Newcastle. When the weather was fine, I would cycle the 6 miles of school to save money and to help me get fit. At that time, I had 3 main interests: rugby, popular music, and finally the theatre. Life was different in those days. For instance, cinemas were only allowed to be open on a Sunday at the discretion of the local watch committee. The watch committee in Newcastle refused to allow them to open, whereas Gateshead did. However, the Newcastle concert halls were allowed to open for band concerts. Occasionally, me and my friends would get the tram, or later the bus, to Gateshead station and then walk over the Tyne Bridge with a group of teenagers to go to a concert by such bands as Joe Loss, Cyril Stapleton or Ted Heath, only to meet a crowd of teenagers walking across the bridge from Newcastle to go to the pictures in Gateshead. Newcastle was fortunate to have 3 main theatres: the Palace and Empire, which were mainly for variety shows, and the Royal, which was for more serious productions. There was also a repertory theatre near Jesmond Dean. My family regularly went to the theatre, and I remember once seeing at the Empire an act called Ted and Barbara Andrews, who were musicians, and they had with them on stage also performing their daughter Julie Andrews. I wonder what became of her. We would go and see anything at the Royal. In those days, a star was a famous actor or actress, usually in films, not just someone who acted in a soap opera. Not that there were soap operas, or even TV in those days, but I particularly remember being impressed when I saw 2 stars of the films at the Royal, Orson Welles in Othello and Tyrone Power in The Devil's Disciple. I was a great fan of Noel Coward, having seen and read some of his plays and films. I also liked his music, especially his comedy songs. I was thrilled when I read that the world premiere of his play Relative Values was to be at the Royal. On that day, together with some of my friends, I went and queued for the gods and enjoyed the performance. The next day I was cycling home through Newcastle when a figure stepped off the curb in front of me. It was a man wearing a very smart camel hair coat, dark brown trilby hat, and he had a red carnation in his buttonhole. It was Noel Coward. I stopped him and asked for his autograph. "Delighted, dear boy, delighted," he said, and then signed his name on my school rugby fixture card, the only piece of paper I had in my pocket.
My husband, Brian, had been a pen friend from 1943 until his first leave from abroad during the Second World War. In November 1945, he had a month's leave and he telephoned from France to say he was waiting to cross the channel with a lot of other regiments and we could meet. We agreed to meet outside the Odeon Cinema. As I had not met him before, I was a little concerned as I had only 2 photographs from before he was called up. So I told him what I would be wearing and set off with one of the photographs, one taken in Rome. However, I need not have been anxious as I recognized him the instant he turned the corner. We walked up to the church in Haymarket, where we sat and talked for ages. We then decided to walk to Gosforth Park, talking all the way, lost in our conversation. When we arrived, I was horrified to realise I had left my handbag in the Haymarket on a seat outside the church. We then got on a tram from the terminus back to the Haymarket and looked nervously to see if it was still there. Amazingly and thankfully it was. Coming home a good many years later, we were on a bus and Brian pointed out the very seat, asking if I remembered our first meeting. We were married for 60 years.
Remembering evacuation 1939 or 3 years at the seaside. When war was declared, I was 8 years old, and my world, along with everyone else's, was turned upside down. Our parents were strongly advised that we should be evacuated away from the expected bombing in Newcastle to sea houses on the coast. Wise or not, I wonder. So we reported with our gas masks to Chillingham Road School, were labelled, received parcels of corned beef, condensed milk and biscuits as presents for the hostesses we were to meet, and walked with our parents to Heaton Station. Amid tears and waves, a special train took us to Chat Hill. From there into a barn to be sorted, I suppose, into cars and driven to sea houses. And then we were just dropped at various addresses where people had volunteered to have us. I know now that sea houses is no distance, but it seemed a long way to me and very different from home. My first billet was a funny little general dealer's shop run by a young childish couple, and I hated it. Even now, some smells can take me back to that place. Anyway, they didn't cope with a miserable child, and so I was sent to a well-to-do couple who owned the local garage, but who also weren't used to children. They were very nice, but unfortunately there was another evacuee there who wet the bed. Not nice for me as I had to share. And so off we went to a place where there were 5 of us, including 2 daughters of the house. No inside loo, which didn't help the bedwetter, no bath, just a sink. So we went elsewhere for a weekly shared bath. No radio for news of the war. Just how different from home could it get? But there I stayed for nearly 3 years. We were told how the government only paid 10 and 6 a week for us. But I knew that when my parents regularly visited, my dad paid my keep. We had to help with various duties, and my favourite was looking after the hens and ducks they kept nearby. Our education at first was in the village hall with 1 teacher, but as some children went home, although parents were advised against it, we were integrated into the village school. When I was 11 years old, I passed the scholarship and so had to come home back to Newcastle despite the bombing. To senior school, another upheaval, but it was lovely to be home to my own mam and dad and gran, not to mention my own bedroom and bathroom and workers' playtime and ITMA and the like on the radio. I had seen my parents as they were able to visit. It was upsetting when they went home, but you mustn't fuss or cry, of course. But in retrospect, I would much rather have stayed at home all the time. It must have been very hard for my mother especially, but remember, our physical safety was paramount. Child psychology hadn't been invented, so how we felt at being uprooted came second, understandably, I suppose.
Heaton Station. This station brings the memory of happy families crowding onto the trains for a trip down to the local seaside. The war had just finished and people just wanted to return to normal. In my case, it is a memory of 1945 and the war had only been ended a few months. My dad, who was a Royal Marine, was due to come home, but my mum had no idea where he was or when he would be back. Unknown to her, he was on an express train from London to Edinburgh, passing through Heaton Station on the way. On the journey north, he wrote her a brief note, explaining he was on his way to Edinburgh to be demobbed and would hopefully see her soon. He put this note in an envelope with her name, together with a neighbour's name who worked at Heaton Station. On speeding through Heaton, he managed to throw the note out of a window and it landed on the platform. It was picked up, handed to our neighbour, who of course gave it to my mum. At last she knew he was safe and on his way home.
I worked as a lorry driver for the Co-op Moore's End for 17 years. I had various jobs driving, and one was to visit the Newcastle quayside twice a week to collect goods from the warehouses and the ships. It was a strange view from my cab window. As well as cars and trucks, I now had to watch out for diesel engines and railway wagons. Goods were loaded and unloaded from them to the ships berthed alongside, from the swing bridge to Spiller's flour mill. This called for patience from me and other truckers, as we had to wait sometimes for 2 hours before it was loaded. The big job was called the Co-op weekly supply of Danish butter and bacon from the Danish butter boat Magnolia. At the weekends, there was and still is a market with stalls selling everything from household goods like tea sets, bedding, to novelties. It was like St James's Park at Christmas, as people so swarmed to the quayside for cheap Christmas presents. Sometimes I had to go across the river for goods, and if it was a time-related collection, it was the dreaded 3 blasts on the swing bridge's horn. That spurred me and other truckers on, as they meant that the bridge was opening. It takes about 6 minutes to open and close. This was usually for the colliers taking coal from the Dunstan Estates to the London power stations. The barges like the Bessie Surtees and the Bobby Shafto were used to move the fly ash from Frighton power station to dumping grounds at sea. Sadly, all this is gone, never to come back, but memories and photographs such as these will inform future generations what was on the quayside.
It was about 7:15 on January the 23rd, 48 years ago, when in answer to a ring on the bell, my mum let in a very flustered minister into our home, clutching a handkerchief to his nose and with blood all down his shirt. I heard it on the local news, and although in the middle of a nosebleed, I had to come and see you were all right, he said. At 19 years of age, I was extremely embarrassed by all the fuss my accident the previous night had caused, especially as I felt okay. It had been in the newspaper and now reported on the television. My current boyfriend and I happened to be in the third car that had been involved in a similar incident, so there had to be some comment by the media. The phone and the doorbell seemed to ring all day with concerned relatives and friends inquiring about our welfare, and now the minister was involved. My boyfriend's sister had just bought a new car and had said that he could take me out in it for a run. As it was a very nice, bright night, we thought a trip to Tynemouth would be a good idea. When we arrived, we parked the car in the car park on the point, where we sat and talked over our future plans before deciding to drive back. He started up the car, put it in gear, and we drove straight over the cliff. As we began the drop of 30 feet, my friend bumped his head on the steering wheel and knew no more. I, on the other hand, did not see my life flash before me, but somehow became very calm, knowing we would be all right. When we landed upright on the beach, the passenger window shattered, and I managed to free myself, knowing I would have to get Michael out in case the car went up in flames. Fortunately, the engine must have cooled. It wasn't very warm, and a young man suddenly rushed up to help me, muttering how the people in the nearby house, although not very pleased, had sent for an ambulance. By the time it arrived, my friend was back with us, but totally unaware of what had happened. We were taken to Tynemouth Infirmary, where they decided to keep him in overnight, and I sat and waited for my dad to come and pick me up and take me home, where my mum had a hot bath waiting. So I got a couple of days off work, some jazzy stockings to hide the bruises, and a mention in the press. And Michael, although he couldn't remember the actual incident, a date he would always remember. The media coverage was because, as the third couple to have a car go over at this point, it was decided it would be wise to put some railings around the car park. As I have never been back, I wouldn't know if this was achieved. Maybe now is the time. Apart from upsetting my family and friends, I was sorry I was unable to thank those who did help us that night. Strangers can be very kind. However, by the time the car was hoisted from the beach, anything remotely useful had been removed. Tyres, wheel hubs, etc. It was ever thus.
You come here when you were little, my granddaughter asked me. Oh yes, but it was very different then, I told her. I used to be a messenger girl. There were two of us, and we worked for the CWS. That means Cooperative Wholesale Society. It was our job to deliver letters from all the factories in Pelo. There was the shirt factory, the drug and dry saltery works, the tailoring factory, the printing works, and the cabinet works. Every morning we called at each place to collect the letters, then travelled to Newcastle on the train to deliver them to various CWS buildings all over Newcastle. This place, the Discovery Museum, was the main office building for the CWS. It had 5 floors, and we had to deliver letters to every floor. We weren't allowed to use the lift. When we delivered the mail, we had to pick up more to take back to all the factories in Pelo. Other buildings we had to deliver to in Newcastle, all multi-storey buildings, were Newgate Street. This is now the Gate Leisure Centre. Down on the quayside was the warehouse. That building is now the Malmaison Hotel. We also delivered to offices in Thornton Street and Waterloo Street. I believe these are now luxury apartments. We had to do this trip every morning. When we finished, if we'd any money, we went to a small cafe opposite the old Marlborough Crescent bus station. We could buy a freshly baked, still warm buttered tea cake and a cup of tea for 6pence. Once we finished, it was back to catch the train to Pelo to deliver the mail we had collected in Newcastle to all the Pelo factories. Then it was time for lunch before we had to do it all again in the afternoon.
My parents opened the shop in 1934 as A.N. Clough's confectioners, tobacconists and general dealers of Heaton Road, Heaton. The shop had 2 windows at the front divided by an entrance doorway. One was the sweet shop, filled to capacity, or so it seemed, as many of the boxes of loose sweets were dummied. That means that they all looked full but had packing underneath, and the other was known as the soap window. In 1938, when the war was looming, my dad joined the Auxiliary Fire Service, that's the AFS. He was a part-time fireman based at several stations around Newcastle, but Heaton Park Road Fire Station, attached to the school, is dominantly in mind. On the night of the 25th of April 1941, the Germans bombed Guildford Place and Cheltenham Terrace, and the blast blew out the shop windows, hurtling the contents of the window and shop into the street. Splintered timbers and glass plate shards poked out through the void, and soap powders shared the pavement with a mishmash of multicoloured rationed sweets. My dad, leading fireman Arthur Clough, was called out, but imagine how he felt when he passed the devastation of his own shop, bound on his way to a different incident. The first memory that I can recall is when I was 4 years old. My mother took me to the front door, and we stared at the golden red sky that was ablaze with the light of the worst Newcastle upon Tyne fire of the entire war. During the night of the 1st of September 1941, 22 younger bombers were deployed in a raid over Newcastle. The huge depot and sidings of Newbridge Street goods station received direct hits by several incendiary bombs and an oil bomb. 300 tons of food were destroyed. The main building was hit and an insecure wall collapsed, resulting in one of Dad's colleagues receiving fatal injuries. The store of margarine and sugar was fiercely alight, and Dad described the atmosphere as a fog of floating burnt sugar ash, so dense that the visibility was virtually nil. Dad fell through an open manhole, but his elbows got wedged in the hole. With water pouring down it, his hold getting weaker, and the noise and commotion drowning his cries for help, it was only when one of his men stumbled over him that he was pulled out in time and lived to survive the war.
It was a day I'll never forget. June 1981. The whole school was invited to the launch of the Ark Royal. I had the pleasure of teaching some of the children of the riveters, fitters and engineers who built her. We snaked our way to the shipyard and waited alongside the gathering crowds. The bulk of the Ark loomed above us and blotted out the skyline. The little ones were restless and the older children were full of speculation. A band began to play. I hoisted one tiny child onto my shoulders and others onto each hip. Not PC or health and safety in those days. Their dads had worked hard, wages well earned and eagerly waited for by the wives of the lads if they hadn't drunk them or gambled them away on the way home on Friday nights. A dot of colour appeared in the distance, the Queen Mother. The band stopped playing. The crowd became silent. Champagne was smashed against the Ark's bow, and she began to move effortlessly towards the Tyne. There were huge waves, and we feared she would go to the Gateshead shore. She turned. Everyone held their breath. A huge cheer went up. The pride amongst the men was palpable. It was a job well done. Ark Royal is to be broken up, not in her own yard, but far away in Turkey. It's such a shame she hasn't been allowed to come home.
I was 12 years old, and the Second World War had just begun. And as a child, I'd always been encouraged by my family to enter for talent contests. I remember putting my name down for such a contest at a theatre called the Isolde, which was at the top of Waterloo Street in Newcastle. The contest was to be on Friday night, and you were to be accompanied on stage by Eric Lord, who was the resident organist, who was incidentally a member of the NFS, the National Fire Service. I had reached the second line of my song when the air raid siren was sounded and Eric Lord suddenly disappeared, as he had to report to the nearest fire station. To make matters even worse, the theatre was cleared and I was left singing Little man, you've had a busy day with no accompaniment. To make matters even worse, there was this tremendous anti-aircraft barrage being set up by our own Agag guns, which were perched on the top of Lobley Hill, who were firing at German bombers coming up the River Tyne. And do you know, my sister, my mother and myself walked 2 miles home. The shrapnel was raining like hailstones, and the 4th goods station was bombed that night and burned for 3 weeks. Such was my baptism of fire into the music business. At a later date, I was having a music lesson at home with my music teacher when there was a deafening bang. We heard later that a solitary German bomber had dropped a bomb on Spillers next to the Tyne Bridge. My music career had certainly started with a bang.
My name is Bill Paxton. Memorable times in my wartime life and afterwards on Stamfordham Road, Westerhope. At the time, I was 7 years old in 1943. Walking home from Westerhope School, whilst walking past the high wooden fence on the west side of Harris's Market Garden, looking through the fence, a man with dark hair, holding a rake, turned to his right side, his back towards me. I saw he was wearing overalls. He had a big round patch, brown, sewn on, an Italian prisoner of war. Sunday afternoon, summer 1946, at home with my mum and dad. I heard the sound of a car horn being blown. I looked outside, an ice cream van named Cheedy's on side. I went outside to buy for Mum, Dad and myself. I looked up to the face of the man inside the van. "I know you," I said. "You are an Italian prisoner of war. I saw you working in Harris's in 1943. He replied in very good English, "Yes, you're right." I've learned over the years I've been blessed with a photographic memory for faces. I would like to add that being so young and being told by my parents not to speak to the prisoner of war men, along with my friends, we grew up with suspicion being part of our growing up. Seeing this man again got my brain going into gear.
The Wizard of Oz was in at the heating. It was near good asked me mother for war picture money. "Do you think I made of money?" she'd yell. Think it was a good crowd on the look for asking. My mother, God bless her, she's made of a lot of things, but money certainly wasn't one of them. So come Saturday morning, me more young would be up with the larks. With a quick swoosh on the cold tap in the scullery sink, the doorstep slice of jam and bread, washed down with a hot cup of cocoa, we'd be down our backstairs 2 at a time. "Any old rags and jam jobs?" we'd be yelling as we raced out the back gate into the lane. We both breathed a sigh of relief as the old fellow at the rag shop counted the money out in our dirty grasping hands. Half for me ma, the rest for us. So no one could rob us, we'd run home at full pelt in the middle of the road. I'd grip that money so tight in my clenched hand it left an imprint in my palm. The queue wasn't a mile long. It's just right round the block. It was a fight to keep your place. Bigger kids would push in, but we'd keep our gobs shut for fear of being bashed up. Aye, we might have been daft, and there was no arguing with that, but we certainly weren't stupid. In the queue, the excitement grew to fever pitch. When the door finally opened, it was one mad rush to get in. With one young hanging on my short tail, I fought my way in. Inside, the noise was deafening. It was so full we sat 2 on a seat. Feet began to stamp, quiet at first, then louder and louder like thunder. When the curtain finally opened the chair, it almost lifted the roof. We didn't just watch the film. We were in it. Me, I was a lion looking for courage. And War Kid, he was a scarecrow looking for a brain. You know what? I'd like to believe we found them both. Every kid in the place was spellbound, including us. We all wanted to live in that glorious technicolor Never land, far away from the real world outside, with its belching chimneys and soot-blackened houses. Me and War Kid couldn't dance to save our lives, and yet we danced along that yellow brick road and sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow all the way home. Clammed with the hunger and soaked with the skin, we climbed over back stairs. Good crowd round to look off me man for being so late. Sure brought us back to reality, but not at all, could ever take away our dreams.